Have you ever watched a TV or film series that you really loved and then it just took a turn for the worst? Even just in one movie where you really enjoyed the first 3/4 of it and then it just got really disappointing in the end? Well, that can happen when a movie or series breaks its own rules. Now, there's many reasons that a movie or TV series won't stick the landing, right? A lot of the times it's because a show breaks its own rules. I think it'd be fun to analyze a few examples of where stories broke their own rules, and that might be the reason we as an audience didn't resonate with it in the end. So let's jump into it. At the beginning of a story during its first act, the writers or filmmakers, consciously or subconsciously, are setting up a framework for which the story will live within. This influences audiences' expectations and essentially sets the rules. Throughout the film, the story will further commit to certain rules, introduce new rules, or throw out others. That's where it gets tricky though, because you have to reframe and allow time for an audience to adjust expectations with each new rule. Essentially, every story beat needs some sort of setup so that it can have a payoff. In other words, if your main character in the final act of the film suddenly has an ability to use magic to defeat the big bad dragon, but no talk of magic was ever brought up before, you'd feel a bit cheated. Now, rules can be changed. You can introduce new rules, but you have to allow time for the audience to gradually become comfortable with the new rule sets. If you want your main character to use magic in its final moments, at some point you have to start gradually introducing the concept of magic. Then when the magic comes into play for the main character, it won't feel so out of left field. If you've been playing Monopoly for 3 hours and you're getting close to that finish line and you've been putting in all this work and you're about to win the game, and suddenly a new rule is introduced and everyone gets mansions for free on their properties, that just breaks the game. It's kind of a weird example, but you have to introduce new rules and new ideas sooner than later, and so oftentimes series can lose their way when they just start to do things that break the mechanics of the story that were set up at the very beginning. Now let's get into some actual examples. Game of Thrones. A lot of people feel like the show lost its way in its final season or two. I argue that the show really changed dramatically starting with season 5. The first 4 seasons of the show were built in a framework of character-driven stories. What this meant is if a character like Tyrion made a decision, there would be a consequence, whether that was good or bad, and that would propel the story forward. Seasons 5 through 8 changed that rule and it became a plot-driven story, meaning if Tyrion made a decision, that consequence never really came into play because the plot was going to move us forward towards ice dragons or Daenerys burning King's Landing down, regardless of what the character's choices were. There were character choices that sometimes felt illogical because it would be like, well, Jaime Lannister was showing me these types of behaviors, these types of choices, but now we're just taking a left turn in the end and he's going to go run back to his sister. And that's where the plot and the character choices weren't aligning anymore. The rules of the show shifted. So the show became for a different audience. It became for an audience who enjoyed the spectacle of the big action scenes and the big drama that they were trying to put us into, but it was like a manufactured drama, right? Whereas before it just felt a lot more organic because it felt directly tied to character choices. The movie Mickey 17, I loved Mickey 17. I was really enjoying it. But then I felt like in the last 30 minutes, it really devolved into something it didn't properly set up. And it became what I felt like was a bit of a politically charged film. And I didn't feel that it was set up to be a politically charged film. That wasn't really the expectations or the rules the film set up for itself. But then when it became that, it felt out of place. And even though I feel like I aligned with a lot of the political views the movie had, I was frustrated that it was emphasizing those over the story beats it had prioritized earlier. And that created a jarring and disjointed experience, which ultimately left me feeling disappointed in the end. The Disney Star Wars films, they started with The Force Awakens, which you can love it or not, but it set rules for what we should expect, for where the story was going to go, for how it was going to treat these characters. And when The Last Jedi came out, it was a very divisive film. It chose to break the rules that Force Awakens set up. You can appreciate Last Jedi as much as you want, but it did actually break the rules that Force Awakens set for it. Now, breaking the rules doesn't mean it has to be a bad thing if you evolve them throughout the film. But when you start the film with Luke Skywalker throwing the lightsaber out, this was something the previous film built to and put stakes towards and when your sequel film just undermines that and rewrites the rules and just says, no, this is how we're treating things now, it's a jarring experience for the audience, therefore creating kind of a gap there. A lot of times rules in film or rules in story are what the filmmakers are telling us to expect as an audience. So you can subvert audience expectations, but when there's a huge disregard for everything that they had set up, it can be a frustrating experience for an audience, i.e. The Last Jedi. Whether you like the film or not, it did not effectively build on the prior film's narrative. It restarted the narrative, which is problematic when it comes to building a cohesive trilogy. I asked my wife for an example of a film that she was disappointed in the ending to, and one of the films she brought up was The 40-Year-Old Virgin. And I think that's another example of a movie breaking its own rules. It started out as a raunchy comedy, and it was that for the first 2/3 of the film, and then it took kind of a dramatic shift towards just being an actual romance film. And for people who signed up for the raunchy comedy, the romance of the last 30 minutes or so can feel kind of boring or not what you signed up for. Doesn't make it a bad film, but I think it's an example of a movie breaking the rules that it set up for itself at a later stage of the film when it's harder to accept. I was trying to think of good examples where movies broke the rules and it was effective, but it was actually kind of hard to come up with. I was kind of going through movies in my mind and was like, oh, Inglourious Basterds kind of broke the rules in the end by, killing Hitler. But like, no, everything was built towards killing Hitler, and so it didn't really break rules by just doing that at the end. Which brings me to my next point. Rules are defined within the context of its own story, and you don't necessarily need to look at the source material or historical accuracy of that. That's not necessarily breaking the rules because the movie created its own new rule set. Something that's a remake or an adaptation isn't necessarily living within the same rules as whatever it's adapting. Now, again, you want to probably be careful, if you want to go back to the Batman v Superman example, Batman killing people in that movie was jarring for some people because Batman historically, in other adaptations, doesn't kill people. Then it also brought me to classic cinema or storytelling rules, and films like Deadpool break classic cinema rules in the sense that there's a lot of meta commentary or breaking the fourth wall, but those are rules that are set up within that franchise. You expect that to happen when you see a Deadpool movie. Basically, they write the rule that there are no rules. What's important is rules matter, even if the rule is to break the rules. Establishing intent and writing within that is important. Rules keep shows from getting the better of themselves. You have to think within the parameters of what you set up and the expectations you've set up for the film. If you break these rules and you defy those rules, it can create a really frustrating experience for the audience. So the next time you're disappointed by a movie or disappointed by a TV show, just kind of think back, why were you disappointed? I'd be curious to know what those stories are for you guys. Leave them in the comments below. But thank you guys so much for interacting and commenting and liking and subscribing. I am a newer channel. It would mean so much to me if you did click the bell and you did subscribe, like, or leave comments. We'll talk to you guys in the next video. See you soon.